Today, we are going to talk about one of the great strategists of history. The figure of Napoleon Bonaparte emerged after the French Revolution. He ended up taking absolute power, crowning himself as emperor, and embarking on an expansionist spiral, the Napoleonic Wars. Beyond the military sphere, as a ruler, Napoleon forced Europe to enter the modern era, and included some of the ideas arising from the Enlightenment in his policies. He promoted a new civil code, which, amongst other things, established the meritocracy of the civil service, prohibiting birth-based privileges, and advocated religious freedom. Napoleon Bonaparte was born in Ajaccio in 1769 on the French island of Corsica. He was the son of impoverished local nobility of the island. The same year, the French had taken over Corsica, so as a child, Napoleon grew up in an anti-French environment. However, his father, Carlo, eventually accepted French domination and managed to get Napoleon and his brother Joseph into the military school in Brienne, in mainland France. These were not easy years. The Corsicans spoke Italian, so he was mocked. His companions laughed at his strange name and pointed out his poor pronunciation of French. To avoid scorn, he took refuge in reading. He also excelled in mathematics and geography. He ended up studying artillery at the École Militaire of Paris. In 1785, his father died. He graduated and was commissioned as second lieutenant in artillery. He moved to Valence, where he learned how to deal with and manage the troops. During these years, he continued to devour books by Voltaire, Rousseau, Racine, and the Abbé Raynal. Napoleon begins to believe in the enlightened ideals of the French Revolution, but not in the forms or purity of its principles. However, he adhered to these revolutionary principles as they could be used as a springboard in his military career. In 1793, the French royalists harassed Toulon, supported by an Anglo-Spanish squad, but the revolutionaries managed to defend the stronghold. The young Napoleon played a leading role and ended up being appointed brigadier general. In 1795, an armed revolt by royalists and National Guards threatened the convention of our young Corsican, defended the Tuileries Paris with his cannon. Napoleon was now a hero. He fell in love with a woman who had been married for 6 years and had 2 children. Her name was Josephine, and she was born in the colonies, specifically in Martinique. The marriage is arranged, and they are married in 1796. Shortly after the wedding, Bonaparte changes his surname to Bonaparte, which sounds more French, and takes command of the Italian army. He launches a campaign against the Austrians with a series of dazzling victories, extending his international fame. He forces Austria to sign a peace treaty that puts the young French Republic in possession of most of northern Italy and expands the border to the Rhine. Napoleon acts independently. The board of directors are annoyed. They don't like the Corsican general acting this way, but on the other hand, he is a famous officer who controls a victorious army. A new Caesar. They have no choice but to ratify what he decides. They want him removed from France and propose the invasion of Great Britain. Napoleon dismisses the idea. The superiority of the English at sea is evident. He conceives another plan, to cut off their commercial route to the east by conquering Egypt and Syria, which belonged to the Ottoman Empire. The Egyptian project was approved, and the expedition would have 2 strands, a military and a scientific one. On more than 400 ships traveled soldiers, sailors, horses, cannons, scientists, artists, and more. After seizing the island of Malta, he finally landed in Alexandria, which he also took without much resistance. He continued on to Cairo, where the Battle of the Pyramids took place. Although the Mamluk cavalry were superior in number, nothing could withstand the French firepower. After the battle, France obtained Cairo and Lower Egypt. However, Admiral Nelson appeared off the mouth of the Nile, defeating the French fleet at Abukir. Napoleon became isolated and, to make matters worse, the Ottoman Empire made a pact with the British to declare war on Napoleon. Finally, he managed to defeat the Ottomans and Napoleon returned to Europe. In France, he is acclaimed as a liberator. The Egypt campaign is hailed as successful. Taking advantage of the weakness of the board of directors, he proclaimed himself consul, together with Sieyès and Ducos, staging a coup d'etat in November 1799, known as the Coup of 18 Brumaire. But Napoleon's ambition knew new bounds. In 1802, a reform was approved by a plebiscite, making Bonaparte consul for life, and in 1804, like Julius Caesar, Charlemagne, and Charles V, he was given the imperial crown. In Notre Dame Cathedral, in the presence of the Pope, Napoleon crowned himself Emperor of the French. By now, it was difficult for the revolutionary Corsican to disguise the fact that he was riding on a dictatorial path. In 1805, the Milan Cathedral, he was crowned the King of Italy, while Europe was growing nervous. The Third Coalition is formed, a military alliance between the United Kingdom, Austria, Russia, Naples, and Sweden. That same year, at Cape Trafalgar, Admiral Nelson defeated the Franco-Spanish squadron, clouding Napoleon's dream of conquering England. But on the other hand, the new Emperor of the French achieved a decisive victory at the Battle of Austerlitz. This confrontation is studied in military academies as a tactical masterpiece by Napoleon, at the level of Cannas or Gaugamela. It marked the end of the Holy Roman Empire when Francis of Habsburg-Lorraine, the last emperor, renounced the imperial crown to remain only as Austrian emperor. Napoleon had already formed the Confederation of the Rhine, the name given to the Confederation of German states that were clients of the Napoleonic Empire. Also, 3 Bonaparte brothers, Joseph, Louis, and Jerome, were placed on the throne. Joseph Bonaparte as King of Naples, Louis Bonaparte as King of the Netherlands, and later, after defeating the Prussians, Jerome Bonaparte as King of Westphalia. With the European chessboard dominated, and unable to take on the Royal Navy on its own, he decreed a blockade of the United Kingdom. No European country would trade with the British. And at the height of his power, Napoleon would make 2 great mistakes of his life. Mistakes that would cost him his career. Those 2 mistakes were Spain and Russia. At the end of 1807, under the pretext of moving his troops to Portugal, he occupied the Iberian Peninsula. The distrust and discontent of the Spaniards increased. Napoleon summoned the King of Spain, Fernando VII, and his father, Charles IV, who had abdicated a few days earlier. Meanwhile, in Madrid, an uprising against the French invader took place on the 2nd of May. This uprising would start the Peninsular War to free themselves from the yoke of Napoleon, who had declared his brother, Joseph, as the King of Spain. In 1808, the Napoleonic army had suffered its first major defeat in the open. It was the Battle of Bailen. The news spread throughout Europe. The Emperor's troops were not invincible. Napoleon had no choice but to take action and go to Spain himself. In 1810, after being certain that Josephine could not bear him a son, Napoleon divorced her to marry Marie-Louise of Austria, daughter of his former enemy, Francis I of Austria, now allied with France. Marie-Louise gave him a son, also called Napoleon, whom she named King of Rome and his successor. The campaign in Russia was disastrous. Napoleon invaded the country with an army of over 600,000 men, and although he managed to take Moscow, the policy of flight and scorched earth, the long distances and the arrival of the Russian winter wreaked havoc on the decimated French troops, who were forced to retreat. France never recovered from the bloodshed. The anti-French forces regrouped in a new coalition that confronted Napoleon in 1813 with a much larger army. After the Battle of the Nations in Leipzig, the largest armed confrontation of all the Napoleonic Wars, Napoleon withdrew. As a result of the defeats he suffered in the Peninsular War, Napoleon recognized Ferdinand VII as the King of Spain. As he would confess years later, he had misjudged the issue of Spain. It's summed up in this famous quote, "The Spaniards all behaved as one man of honor." Paris was occupied on 31st of March 1814, and Napoleon abdicated at Fontainebleau, and was forced to withdraw as regent to the small island of Elba off the Italian coast. With Napoleon out of the way, the old regime was restored, eliminating some of the ideological conquests achieved by the French Revolution. Louis XVIII, brother of the guillotined Louis XVI, was restored to the throne of France. The return from exile of Ferdinand VII also meant the restoration of absolutism in Spain. The new order of Europe was the work of the sovereigns of the victorious powers who met at the Congress of Vienna between September 1814 and June 1815. France returned to its borders of 1792, before the Napoleonic conquest took place. The Confederation of the Rhine was succeeded by the German Confederation, which grouped 39 German states into a confederation of sovereign states under the presidency of the House of Austria. Tsar Alexander I would sponsor the creation of the Holy Alliance, joining Austria and Prussia in defending the monarchical and anti-liberal regime. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. In March 1815, some alarming news caused all the courts of Europe to be astonished. Napoleon had escaped from the island of Elba and was once again in Paris at the head of a growing army. An army with British, German and Dutch troops confronted him near the village of Waterloo, in present-day Belgium. The Allied army was led by the Duke of Wellington, who had played an important role in fighting the French in alliance with the Iberian armies in the Peninsular War, and Napoleon was defeated, this time for good. Abdication would be his only way out. Louis XVIII re-entered Paris on the 8th of July, 1815. Napoleon surrendered. This time, he was banished. He was sent to the inhospitable island of St. Helena, a small British island in the South Atlantic, in the middle of nowhere. He died there 6 years later. His remains were repatriated years later and rest in Les Invalides in Paris.